I began my life in journalism by begging my way into an unpaid apprenticeship with Amy Goodman, the host of Democracy Now! It was during the 1990s and Bill Clinton was president. Saddam Hussein was firmly entrenched in power as the dictator of Iraq, and that country was suffering in an unimaginable way. The 1991 Gulf War, launched by President Bush, had decimated Iraq's civilian infrastructure. A modern Middle East nation had been bombed back decades. Water and sewage treatment facilities had been attacked systematically. Cancer rates were skyrocketing, and hospitals could not import basic medicines, analgesics, cancer treatments. That's because Bush followed up his destruction of Iraq by imposing what would become the most sweeping economic sanctions in history. What that meant is that Iraq's civilian infrastructure was obliterated during the bombing and the war, and then it was prohibited from rebuilding the country or even offering the most basic medical care. When Bill Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush and won the presidency in 1992, one of his first acts as president was to bomb Iraq. And the justification for that bombing was an alleged plot by Saddam Hussein to assassinate Bush on a visit to Kuwait. That turned out to be totally false. But Bill Clinton's bombing killed several Iraqi civilians, including the famed painter Layla al-Attar. Throughout the Clinton years, Iraq was bombed on average once every 3 days, under the guise of the so-called no-fly zones. And it was in this period that I began traveling to Iraq as a young reporter, and many of the stories I did focused on the ongoing death toll and suffering caused by Bush's war and the economic weapon of sanctions.
1.5-year-old Hamoudi Abbas is going to die, maybe in a week, maybe in a month, maybe in a year. But his doctor says he won't see a third birthday. Hamoudi was just diagnosed with lymphoma, cancer of the lymph nodes. His face is severely disfigured by a large softball-sized tumor that presses against his left eye. He wears a bib around his neck that says, "I love my mommy." The bib is covered in the blood that Hamoudi has been coughing up. His doctor, Mohammed Kamal, says that with adequate drugs, Hamoudi would have a solid chance of beating the cancer. But he says that because of shortages caused by the U.S.-led sanctions, the necessary drugs are simply not available.
Die within a week, some of them within a month, some of them even a year, but will die sooner or later.
Hamoudi is one of the thousands of children in southern Iraq that have fallen victim to the cancer epidemic that has plagued the region since the end of the 1991 Gulf War.
Reporting from Iraq's hospitals felt to me like reporting from death rows for infants. Doctors would tell you that they knew how to treat their patients, but they didn't have the supplies or the medications necessary to do so. Syringes were being reused. Tylenol was banned. Bleach was banned. Equipment for X-ray machines was banned. I saw children born with congenital birth defects that did not exist in modern medical journals. The U.S. strategy was to starve, kill, torture Iraqis into rising up against Saddam Hussein. And I saw with my own eyes how U.S. policy made Saddam stronger and how it forced Iraqis that may have organized their own version of an Arab Spring uprising to spend every ounce of their human energy on simply surviving. Iraq is why I ultimately became a reporter. I'm still haunted by the memories of the dead I saw there, particularly the children. In Iraq, I spent a lot of time with the U.S. peace activist Kathy Kelly, the co-founder of the group Voices in the Wilderness. She went to Iraq during the 91 Gulf War and camped out in the desert in protest of that war. She spent extensive time in Baghdad as the missiles rained down. And then throughout the 1990s, Kathy lived for long periods in Iraq over the years, organizing against the sanctions and the bombings implemented by Bush and continued by Clinton.
I mean, I really believe that the strategy was to say to every other country in the region, maybe in the world, if you do not subordinate yourselves to fill our national interest, to serve our national interest, we can eliminate you. And if you don't believe it, look at Saddam Hussein, look at Iraq.
As we watch the coverage on corporate television of George H.W. Bush, the focus when it comes to Iraq is how Bush built this coalition of willing nations to force Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait. There's no mention of how the U.S. was arming Saddam for a decade prior to that, helping him identify targets to bomb in Iran, No mention of how Bush encouraged Iraqis to rise up and then gave Saddam the green light to slaughter those who had risen against him.
There's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside.
There's scant mention of the role that the U.S. played in fueling and arming the Iran-Iraq war that preceded the invasion of Kuwait. There's no mention of how the CIA cultivated and supported Saddam in his rise to power. There's no talk of how the U.S. ambassador told Saddam before the invasion of Kuwait that the U.S. didn't have a position on Arab-Arab disputes. None of this. It's as though history exists in a vacuum that will allow nothing in except the sanitized U.S. empire narrative. To truly understand the massive scale of the crimes that George H.W. Bush committed in Iraq, we must look at the 1991 Gulf War and all the civilian targets the U.S. intentionally bombed. But we must also look at Bush's role in supporting Saddam, right up until the eve of that war. We have to talk about Saddam and his CIA friends. We have to talk about the sanctions that lived on for more than a decade after Bush left office and continued to kill innocent people. And we have to talk about the horrors in Iraq today and how they can all be traced to the legacy that George H.W. Bush built.
It became, I think, such a difficult setting in which to live that people actually would say, if there is a light at the tunnel, it's probably only a train coming to run us over. And that ended up being sort of true. And thinking of all that in relation to the formation of jihadist groups, we really shouldn't be surprised. I mean, I sometimes think of even a tiny fraction of what Iraqis were afflicted with in terms of war and sanctions and indignities and displacement, refugees, separation of families, all the, I suppose, collateral consequences of war had happened here in the United States. Do we think there might be vigilante groups that might form up and might become violent and say, if we get guns, we're going to shoot the people that we think? So, I mean, we're just over and over again in Syria and now in Yemen, creating the likelihood of groups like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda. And U.S. people are so undereducated about those connections.
That again was Kathy Kelly of Voices in the Wilderness.